It says that, you know, the old C1 zoning, the old zoning that said just, here's what your yard is, here's what your parking is, and here's what your uses are, and here's your height, that's not really quite enough. Because you could tear down something great on North Highland and put back what is now the CVS with a big parking lot in the front. And so the commercial zoning districts in the city started to change to integrate some just basic urban design principles. And so your NC zoning says, okay, you can redevelop the site. It's not a historic district. You don't have to keep any building on North Highland. But if you redeveloped it, it would have to be built up to the sidewalk. You can't put a big parking lot in the front like you could in the old zoning. And so, but that same idea has not translated into the residential zoning in the city of Atlanta. And as the city of Atlanta updates its zoning ordinance, they are going to address that more with the single-family zoning districts to bring them up to speed with what's been happening in the commercial districts. Now, the details of that will be different because it's not a commercial district. These are neighborhoods. But the same concept will apply. So our recommendation here is that you work with the city of Atlanta as the city of Atlanta updates its zoning ordinance, and you consider what details would fit this neighborhood that doesn't make it a historic district. But for example, you may find as a community that if a new house builds a big garage right up on the sidewalk and 2 doors of garage right up on the sidewalk, that doesn't really fit the design and the pattern of the neighborhood. It's not about historic preservation. It's not about that you can't tear down a building. It's just a basic design concept. And so our recommendation is not for any of those necessarily any of those details right now. The recommendation is that you work with the city as the zoning code's being updated to explore which design concepts could fit for you for your single-family neighborhood. Okay, so 2 more. Barnett Street. So this was an idea that we started to realize that in terms of north-south connections through the city, through your neighborhood, the Barnett becomes perhaps the better opportunity in Virginia-Highland for bike and ped connections going north-south through the neighborhood. It's a residential street, so it doesn't carry the commercial function that North Highland does. It doesn't operate like Monroe does, and that's on the edge of your neighborhood. And Barnett, because it's just a residential street, and it's also a wider residential street, that has the potential to be your primary north-south bike ped connection for your neighborhood, for folks to be able to get from up on the north side of the neighborhood down to the south side of the neighborhood. We also noticed that there's an opportunity to connect with Barnett some pretty interesting nodes and interesting destinations in the neighborhood. Barnett can connect you from Freedom Park to the south, which also gets you into the trail system to get to downtown or to the East Side Trail. And then as you go north, it can connect you with John Howell Park. And then it also connects you with a little jog to Inman Middle. And then it may be possible, there's an old alley connection that goes north of there that can get you to Orm Park. And we think it could be possible that through that system you could connect Orm Park, Inman Middle, John Howell Park, and Freedom Park and the trail system through what we're calling this Barnett Green Line. We're just calling it a Green Line. And we think that could be a better alternative than trying to make North Highland become your real bike infrastructure. Now, again, we said we want to have sharrows on North Highland, so we think it should still accommodate bikes, but we think it could be a better alternative to do Barnett for your primary bike ped connection. Last thing is St. Charles Avenue. One of the things the city asked us to do as we started this process was please find a way to connect the Beltline trail system to the Druid Hills Park system. And Ponce is very challenged from the Beltline to Moreland and Briarcliff to accommodate the 2 bike lanes. So we now know that we got the 2 bike lanes on Ponce west of the Beltline, right? But it's very challenging for the city, and because of the width of the road and the right-of-way, to get 2 bike lanes on Ponce east of the Beltline along Ponce. And so what the city asked us to do is help us find another way to do that and not using Ponce. So what we realized was St. Charles is wide enough where you can do, you can keep 2 travel lanes on St. Charles, you can add 2 dedicated bike lanes, you can stripe them, and you can keep both sides of on-street parking on St. Charles. So you keep everything that's there today, but you can add the 2 bike lanes. And by result, we think that slows the road down a little bit too, because it doesn't appear to be a wide open asphalt and wide lane. It can narrow those travel lanes a little bit. So what we've recommended is first that we think you need to get elevated. We need a way to get elevated up to the Beltline from Ponce. There is some room on the west side of the Beltline Trail between the CVS and the Beltline. There's room there that you could do that. We think that it's the Highland View Apartments, just north of the Highland View Apartments on Ponce Place. There's about a 10-foot buffer that is just their side yard of the Highland View Apartments on Ponce Place. We think that you could carve out a trail bike connection in that yard. And then there's a pretty large, probably a 20-foot front yard to the Highland View Apartments right on Ponce Place, and then it has a parking lot next to that. There's plenty of room in that front yard to continue that bike connection, and then that gets you all the way down to St. Charles. On the east side of North Highland, St. Charles is not wide enough to retain on-street parking and have the 2 dedicated bike lanes. So for just that short distance east of Highland all the way to Briarcliff, you would leverage Sharrow, so just the signs on the street, and not have bike lanes. And then lastly, there is room, there's just enough room on the east side of Briarcliff and the Druid Hills Church. I can't remember the name of it. It's not Presbyterian. United Methodist, yeah. So the Druid Hills United Methodist Church, they have just enough of a yard in front of their parking lot that you could continue the bike and ped trail and get down to Ponce, and then that connects you into the Druid Hills system of trails and into the east side trail. So that's the big idea, and that's how we can connect the Ponce bike lanes, the Beltline bike system into St. Charles. And we think ultimately connecting the commercial districts with the Beltline is one of the most important things that needs to happen. You can't pick up and move the commercial district over to the Beltline, and you wouldn't want to. But you also, the Beltline is such a major investment in infrastructure in the city, and for the next 50 years, so much of the city's resources is going to be focused on the Beltline. And so what we want to be able to do is you want to make anything that's on the Beltline great, but then you want to make those things that are just off of the Beltline, you want to get them connected to the Beltline. And I think what's going to happen over time is that people who use the Beltline are going to realize that the best part of the Beltline is when you get off the Beltline and you explore the things that are right off the Beltline. And so what you want to be able to do is position North Highland Corridor in your commercial districts to be this thing that is this amazing destination for people who are using the Beltline. That they just get off the Beltline, there is this really great historic neighborhood commercial district. And so St. Charles becomes really important for that. And it really is a great street for that kind of a connection. It's wide, it's sort of grand, and it's a great front door feeling for people coming off the Beltline and just experiencing your neighborhood, going to a commercial district, and then heading back. And the same thing can happen with Virginia. So those two become extremely important. And that's all I have. So with that,
thank you. So we're collecting the cards, and we're going to try and break them out into topics. So if you give us just a moment here.
That'd be nice.
There's a mountain all the way down that hall.
There you go, Jim. Tall fence.
Thanks.
So I've got a question about Monroe road diet. So, could you talk more about how would they implement it and like sort of some of the logistics? So like what percent increase in cars would the road diet accommodate? Or how would they implement it?
Right. So there's a threshold that is used by transportation engineers for justifying or knowing when a roadway qualifies for a road diet conversion from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. There's road diets of all sizes. You can go from 6 lanes to 5 lanes, but when it's a 4-lane system that shrinks to a 3-lane system with the middle turn lane, the threshold is 25,000 cars per day. But if it's under 25,000 cars per day, then you can make that work. If it's over that, it's a bit too much. And so currently, Monroe operates at about 18,000 cars per day. And so it fits well within the threshold. In terms of how it's implemented, it's an issue of a restriping. And so because of that, you can't do a road diet incrementally. It's not like planting street trees where you can do this block one year and do another block another year. You have to be able to do a larger segment at one time. So the way that the road diet would be implemented is it is just a restriping, but it would happen with really a larger segment. So for example, Park Drive to Monroe. Well, Park Drive really would be just probably north of Monroe, as you get to 10th, Park Drive to just north of 10th. As you get to the 10th Street intersection, there's more turning movements that need to be taken care of. You have to have dedicated turn lanes. And so those have to be accommodated for at the intersection of 10th. But as you get north of 10th, probably 100 feet or so, you would get into the road diet alignment, and you'd have a dedicated middle turn lane, and you'd have 1 lane north, 1 lane south. And again, the concept is this idea. The same thing has been recommended in city policy now for DeKalb Avenue. It's the exact same concept, where you have what they call there the suicide lane, because it can go either direction in the middle. And so the idea there, same thing, the middle lane is a de facto turn lane already. So it's already not carrying a full capacity. The inside lane of a 4-lane roadway never carries a full capacity that 4 lanes could carry if they were all moving in one direction and had no turning movements. So it leverages that, collapses the turning lane movement into a middle lane that gets out of the flow of traffic. And I'd encourage y'all to read the master plan draft document. We've provided some real analysis from our traffic engineers on the concept. And there's several types of conflicts that get simplified and improved when you remove the 4 lanes. So for example, if you're on a side street turning onto Monroe to go in the opposite direction, you now only have to cross 1 moving through lane to get to the other side of the street, as opposed to 2 moving through lanes. And so there's several conflicts that get improved and simplified from a traffic standpoint. And that's why vehicular crashes and pedestrian accidents always go down in road diets. It always goes down, and it moves about the same capacity, but it just does it slower and smoother.
The 18,000 cars that you mentioned in the traffic studies, how old are those? And did you look at peak times and things like that along with it?
Yeah, that's the peak capacity today. That's probably the last year. And it's been going, it's actually, strangely enough, it's been going down the last 4 years or so.
Hold on, hang on 1 second, sir. We're really going to discourage the dialogue, so we get to the maximum number of questions. We can hang around and we'll talk about it in greater detail. Let's get to the maximum number.
So we have a number of questions about accessory dwellings, and before I turn to these,
So that was the only question about the Monroe Road diet. With all the social media questions that are going on, I find that really hard to believe.
well, let's see, Aaron covered the topics. One of the questions is, Yeah, what is the Midtown Morningside Road Diet Plan for Monroe? How would the city implement it? Is it just the Virginia-Highland section? Are we out of sync with other neighborhoods? So that's been covered.
Okay.
What percentage increase of cars will the road diet accommodate? That's been covered. Can you, I did want to get to other topics, but can you amplify why fast-moving heavy traffic on Monroe threatens the existing land use?
Right. So this is a land use pattern that kind of emerges whenever you're on busier, larger corridors and thoroughfares. You see this, Peachtree used to be single-family houses, and Monroe, or not Monroe, but Moreland used to have all single-family houses. And as roadways get bigger and busier and wider and the lanes get faster, it just becomes the kind of thing you can imagine. It's more difficult to live in a single-family house. And so as corridors do get bigger and wider and faster, then the land use is oftentimes threatened to change. And cities really find themselves in a difficult position to deny a rezoning for a property that's losing value because the values are declining, people don't want to live on the home. Now, I don't think that's really completely the case right now for Monroe, but just understanding how cities continue to grow and roads continue to grow if you let them, it's not hard to imagine that eventually Monroe could be that kind of a place where, just like Moreland and just like all these other corridors, it's very difficult to live in a single-family home. So the land use implication is that for single-family neighborhoods, there really is a roadway type and a roadway volume cap to what supports a single-family neighborhood. That as a roadway gets too wide and a roadway gets too busy and too fast, it is no longer truly viable for a single-family land use. And again, I don't think you're completely there today, but for me, one of the benefits of implementing the road diet today is that, one, it works from a transportation engineering perspective with the volume, but two, it helps you to have a roadway system that is more in line, a one lane north, one lane south, and then a middle turn lane. It's more in line with a single-family neighborhood. And I think that's the land use strategy that is more fitting with the vision of the neighborhood to retain both sides of Monroe as single family.
I just had one, because there was another question that I submitted about the Monroe diet. Has input been sought from the homes, from the people living on the side streets? Has anybody checked with those people to see what they're going to think and how they're going to be impacted? Because they're going to be impacted. As it is now, I cut off from Monroe because of the traffic.
I can't speak to the Beltline plan and who they spoke to when that became city policy, and I can't speak to the city transportation plan and who was spoken to for that. I do know through this process we've had comments from people who lived on those streets, on side streets. You find some you find some who still don't understand it and don't see how that would work. Overall, in general, there's more people who get that and are in support of that. But no, we have not talked to every person on the road. And again, this is one of those recommendations where we're really anchored in the fact that it's now part of 2 previous city plans, and the transportation engineers have all done their kind of due diligence on it. And so what I wanted to do through this process was just say, okay, if that's what the city is going to do, let's just make sure some of the details are being covered. Let's make sure people can cross the street, pedestrians can cross the street. Let's make sure we think through the sides of the road diet and what's happening with that before the sidewalks can be built, because that can be 5 years before the sidewalks get built. Let's make sure there's pedestrian signals. And so we've asked those questions and tried to take this plan that's already been approved and see if we can make it better.
So as I said,
Hang on one second, Jennifer. I'm going to add that from the association point of view, we have a ton of comments and complaints from citizens living in and around Monroe about the existing traffic pattern and the usage and the speed and the wrecks and the risks and the difficulty of crossing and the increasing number of folks that want to cross it from the Beltline and from the neighborhood to walk to the park. None of them were consulted in any way about how the traffic on Monroe grew and how it turned from a once more placid street to this other form of usage that it's currently there. So it's kind of poison either way you get it. That nobody asked about that. Hang on one sec. We will, in fact, we absolutely will talk to a lot of folks about this exact challenge there. But there's a huge number of complaints about that, and you know, to the degree that a number of people have suggested specifically that the zoning ought to change. And secondly, there's a pending. This is a matter of public record. This is where people, I hope that everybody will get involved. We adopt the CDP, it's referenced in here. It has the community development plan for the neighborhood. One developer owns, it's his right to do so, every single house on Monroe, on the west side of Monroe, along opposite Mike Goodwin's bike shop, up to Crest Hill, and down Crest Hill on the south side to the very last house. The Beltline originally tried to change the land use there to allow for, that would have allowed rezoning for condominiums and intense development through there. What that would have done to the traffic would have been clear. This neighborhood and this MPU used its CDP, and with the help of Councilmember Juan, was able to prevent that rezoning. It's since been, the existing zoning and land use has since been reaffirmed. So there's real pressure on that end of the neighborhood for more development, which would bring more traffic, which would make, in turn, we greatly fear, have a domino impact down that entire side of Monroe, all the way down, all the way past Park, because the economics would add up if you can put in enough units. And it's very attractive because it's on the Beltline and on the Park. So far, city policy has been that that won't occur, and we're working very, very hard to keep that policy in place, and that means keeping that road under control and livable for single-family homes.
So, as I said, there are a lot of topics that people have submitted
I
questions
appreciate
on.
that. Just one thing, you mentioned that there was,
I really do. I will talk to you about it all night. I promise you I will.
But
But
other people have
hang
questions.
on one second.
Yeah, we have a lot of.
We
We have
have a lot of
questions here,
topics.
and
And I'll talk to you all night.
I'm not concerned about talking to you, Jack, just, you made a comment earlier on about there being,
So we're
No,
so.
we're not allowing these types of questions.
So
This is
why exactly do you
not-
not want everyone in this room to hear the questions that are being asked? That's my question.
The issue is
I wanna
that
hear
we
some
have
more
about
questions.
50 questions up here, and we have limited time at this meeting. As I indicated, we will have an FAQ that will address
so
all
that
of
you can
these
ignore more
questions.
questions that are not answered, right?
By definition, any question that we ask ignores some other questions, and we're going to get through a range of topics. And I'll be glad to stay, as well other members of this committee, to talk to you quite a long period of time about all of these issues. But other people ask other questions that are as important to them as this is to you. We're going to go through a range of them, and I'll be happy to talk to you forever.
So we have 7 questions here on accessory dwellings, perhaps more. We're trying to organize it by topic. Before I ask these questions, I wanted to just read what the master plan says, the paragraph, because again, I know a lot of people didn't have a chance to view the document, and there will be a chance in the coming months. But this is what the draft plan says about accessory dwellings. Work with the City of Atlanta in the upcoming zoning ordinance update process to examine national best practices and methods for integrating accessory dwelling units into established in-town urban neighborhoods. So basically it is examine, is the bottom line. Examine best practices. So there is no specific recommendation in this master plan that accessory dwelling be allowed, and there's no specific guidelines for accessory dwellings. The recommendation in the master plan is examine the issue. But with that background, let me try to go through some of these accessory dwelling questions.
So that has changed from what's on the internet? It's from what was
Yes.
published today?
No, that is the draft plan today on page 133.
And ma'am, I can see what you're holding up. That's a reflection of, right, that page reflects the January meeting, what was put forward at the January meeting, document that, and the final recommendation is pages after that in the recommendation section.
That was confusing.
Yeah, okay, all right, we can clarify that. Yeah, that was just the reflection. We wanted to be clear and transparent with everything we've communicated to date, and that is what we presented in January.
So what she just quoted is further in this
Yeah,
document?
that, what she just quoted is the recommendation.
I would just like to take this moment to present a petition that has been circulated on just a few streets that has 57 names of people who are opposed to the accessory dwellings. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. So Jennifer, is there a question you have?
So, I believe that some of these questions, I mean, it looks like some of the questions are based on the earlier proposals, not the one that's in the plan. Here we go. If the goal is to minimize car traffic, how are accessory dwellings fitting into this plan while adding, while adding more cars parking?
Right. That's a great point. I mean, accessory dwelling units would, by nature, if you have a home that's got a property that has one home, and you added a dwelling unit on that property, then that obviously is increasing a density to it. And so one of the things some cities do is they require, just from a parking perspective, that the parking has to be done on site, that you can't leverage on site or on street parking for accessory dwelling units. That's one way to address making sure that parking isn't challenged and existing on-street parking isn't challenged by accessory dwelling units. But this is a great example of, I mentioned the process, and whenever you do a plan is you work with what you're hearing in the community, you try to find consensus. But we also are working in the reality of that there's the city, right? There's an administration to the city, and there's the departments of the city that have goals and policies. And so in some things in the master plan, we're working with an existing policy. So the Monroe Road Diet's a great example. That was something that's been studied and approved. And so we're working in that context. Accessory dwelling units is not one of those things. So because of that, in this process, we really have a lot of flexibility in what we say about something like an accessory dwelling unit. There's no requirement for that. The city isn't going to make you do that. And so me as the planner, when I hear that there is a desire for people to be able to live in the neighborhood at different stages of life, and people be able to live in the neighborhood when they're young or when they're old and want to stay in the neighborhood, I want to find opportunities for that to happen. This is one of those options. But through that conversation, when we hear that there's not clear consensus on that, then we slow down. And so this is a great example of, in January, we put this idea out there, and we've gotten some pushback on that. And so now, what we say is, don't stop thinking about it, but also we don't have an aggressive recommendation for that. To go.
There's no recommendation at all, is what you said, Jennifer? There's just to examine it?
The
Right.
recommendation is work with the city of Atlanta in the upcoming zoning ordinance update process to examine national best practices and methods.
But that was not what it said already.
Right. Because but that's the point, when that's what we said in January, and we listened,
Now,
and
this is the new one.
we've changed, yeah, right.
Okay, if you
And
read this one and the old one, they say the same thing, it's just reworded. This is a little less specific. Explore is on this one. To examine is on this one.
right.
You're saying the same thing. It's just reworded.
No, our recommendation before was that you start working with the city now, and you see if you can make it happen for your neighborhood. The recommendation now is, don't push it, wait for the city, they're gonna update the zoning, they're gonna start looking into things like this with your neighborhood, and see what the best practices are, see if it's something that can address your concerns. It's much less of an aggressive approach than go starting in January or June and go start trying to figure out how to make it happen for your neighborhood. That's what I wanted to tell you in January, and then we heard that wasn't really what everybody wanted. There's still a lot to consider, there's still not a lot of consensus to it. I don't think, as a planner, I don't think it's something you should completely abandon. I think you should keep asking questions and get more information on it.
How many lots in this neighborhood, this was my question, so hopefully it'll come up. How many lots in this neighborhood would qualify
It depends on what the criteria are.
There's no criteria in the draft recommendation, so.
Just from a land usage standpoint, from a 50% of the covered.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. I mean, the recommendation isn't to, it's not a.
Relatively low number, so.
Well, I will say this, that we have through other processes, we've looked at how many lots would you say were in that area that was looked at for historic? 312. So we looked at an area that had about 312 lots, east of Highland, north of Atkins Park, and about 75% of the lots had homes that were built at about 25-30% of the lot coverage. Now that was just that area. I don't know what it would be for the whole neighborhood.
That's the area I live in, okay.
Yeah.
And besides, people are just going to do what they do now, and they can't build what they want to, they're going to ask for a variance.
Well, let's go on. I think we've answered a number of the accessory dwelling questions, and as I said, the ones that we haven't been able to get to will include on the FAQ. Here's a question generally about traffic. Many of the studies and the traffic data appear to be very dated, as old as 1988 to 1999 and 2007. Why are we not using more current data, given the significant growth of population and resulting traffic?
Yeah, good. So the plans that we have referred to, which again, we have to do that. If it's a city, it's an approved plan for your area, we have to start with that. That's already approved public policy. That all goes back to the 99 North Highland study and all the way up to more recent studies. The traffic data, though, when you look at the plan, we do have your key thoroughfares. We have the traffic volumes from the last year. So the traffic data is current. The reference to old policies, even though they may be 10 years old, if they're still being implemented by the city of Atlanta, that's still active. So those are two different things. The volumes and then the old plans are kind of two different
Is
things.
that all somewhere in that 142 pages?
Right. Yeah. And I can work with you, I can help you find where all that is.
Here are two questions that are related. How will Pond City Market impact traffic and congestion?
Yes. It'll increase, it's not going to be good.
Yeah, so I mean, that, and, you know, part of this is why, you know, the reality is in the city of Atlanta, wherever a piece of property is not developed to its maximum allowance, you have property that is going to have the right to add more development over time. The city of Atlanta doesn't stop someone from building what their zoning lets them build because, you know, 3 blocks down it's getting too busy. And maybe it should work that way, but it doesn't. And so what you have to think through is not just Pond City Market, but you know, it's an in-town desirable neighborhood, and all up and down Ponce and all up and down the Beltline, wherever the zoning allows more density and development, that over time that will happen, I would imagine. And so I think that's why the city of Atlanta, for example, has been looking for more cost-effective ways to deal with mobility, because you can't build enough roads for every piece of property that can build up to its maximum potential. You can't build enough pavement for all the cars that would be associated with that. And this is a clearly urban strategy, that this is what more and more cities are doing. Now, it may not always be popular, but what more and more cities are deciding to do with limited resources and limited budgets is they're deciding that we're going to kind of go all in on high density and other ways of getting around. And there's some friction to that, right? Especially when you're in a place like Atlanta where we've gotten used to the car. And again, not everyone agrees with that decision, but that's what the city is doing. And so that's why things like a restriping to get bike lanes is really cost effective. It's cheap. We don't have to buy all the right-of-way on Ponce to add another lane in both directions. And the millions and millions of dollars and the years and years and years that'll take to just get one more lane each direction, that eventually that'll clog up, and then what do you do? And so cities are kind of going this other way and just deciding it's cheaper, and it's just the only thing we can do is to just go all in on being urban and try and see if people will respond to that and do things like bike and use transit and those kinds of things. So that's really the scenario we're in. So the answer for Ponce City Market is, yeah, it's just going to get more congested, and it's going to get it won't get easier necessarily to drive, but I think the other part of the strategy of cities is to try and bring uses closer together, so that the distances traveled can get shorter. Now, you're always going to have people who live here and work out there, and your job isn't going to move to you, so that doesn't solve everybody's problem. But the more these mixed-use urban centers get built, where the shopping and the grocery store and those things get moved closer together, and you have the ability to get to transit, to get to the longer distances, that's the strategy the city has. So, I hope that addresses that.
The next set of questions are on design guidelines. It says, overwhelmingly, my neighbors and I are in favor of some sort of design and scale guidelines in Virginia-Highland. I think they are needed ASAP. I understand that this would need to be researched and that the residents will be involved. Could the neighborhood effectively select some defining architectural features and elements of scale that will help protect but not be overly restrictive for those that have a fear of being overregulated?
Right.
And the follow-on question, have other neighborhoods done these guidelines?
Yeah, that's good. So, man, the design guidelines thing is going to be just its own process. And I've thought really hard about this. I do believe design guidelines is the best thing for your neighborhood. I do think that most people want something to be done. Not everybody, but most people want something to be done. I don't think most people want a historic district. But other than that, I think most people would like something to be done. And so, but what that something is, I don't think we can know that right now. This master plan process is about so many other things that there is not a clear answer to what the design guidelines will do or should do. I think you're going to have a dedicated process, very much like when your neighborhood worked with the commercial property owners to rezone the commercial districts to the neighborhood commercial zoning. It's going to have to be like that. It's a dedicated process. It's not about other streets, and it's not about traffic, and it's just about design guidelines.
What does today's version of the plan say about that? Because that was a misunderstanding I had in the last version. The last version I said new construction, I believe.
Right.
What does today's version say?
Today's version says, it says
I've
to,
got it
I
right
didn't
here.
get to that. Yeah.
Sorry. Design guidelines. Work with residents in the city of Atlanta to explore the creation of neighborhood design guidelines to regulate specific single-family design elements for new construction. Enlist community input to further identify issues with new construction and draft guidelines to solve for those specific problems. This approach can be viable for balancing the concerns of a lack of standards for new construction with the concerns regarding individual property rights. Elements to address could include window fenestration, front porches, building materials, or garage location orientation. And Aaron, one thing that has been discussed in the past with this would be perhaps an overlay zoning. So can you describe the process that would lead to, the process for enacting a zoning change?
right, so a lot of this is going to depend on what the city of Atlanta is doing with their new zoning. One of the ways this could happen is that you retain your existing zoning, right? So you've got R4, you have R5 in your neighborhood. You could retain the exact same zoning that you have today, and then there could be an overlay zoning. And if you're familiar with zoning and the Beltline has an overlay zoning district, which just means that there's a zoning district that's overlaid on top of your other zoning, your existing zoning. So there could be an overlay zoning where you keep your single-family zoning and the overlay just says a few things about design. That's one way it could happen. Another way it could happen, if y'all are familiar, are y'all familiar with the so-called infill ordinance changes that the city made probably 5 years ago now? The city created citywide change that changed how a single-family property could build in terms of where it's grade, the definition of the grade of the lot. So what the surface of the lot, what the height of the lot is, that got redefined by the city for the entire city, for all single-family homes. That changed it so that you couldn't take an existing lot and bring in a few truckloads of dirt, and then at the end of the day, your lot now is up here, it starts up here. So the city said that's not allowed, you can't do that anywhere in the city. There may be some things that through the zoning update that the city is going to initiate, that they decide there's some things about single-family neighborhoods that we just want to address for the whole city. Just like that, just like what you can't do with the grade of your lot. So that's why I say work with the city, because you're going to want to make sure whether it's a citywide change or something you can just do for your neighborhood, that it's still something that's in line with what the consensus of the community is. I think if you work to create your own design guidelines, though, that you just need a process to really dig in and understand how far is too far and what is it that we can accomplish? What is the consensus? And honestly, through this process, I'm not clear on what that would be. What I am clear on is that I don't think most people are for historic district, but I think a lot of people want something to be done. So that's why my recommendation is to continue that, move in that direction, move in the direction of doing something, but begin a process that's a specific strategic process to determine what that something is.
Can you define for us what that new construction means versus, is it a new home or wasn't an existing home?
Oh,
or is that?
I honestly, I
Or a
think,
second story.
yeah, honestly, I think that's just got to be part of what you all decide.
I'm just asking what the intent was for what's in the plan.
Well, I mean, the intent is definitely for brand new construction.
Okay.
Now, when you get into the nitty gritty of, okay, when I renovate my house, if I renovate 75% of it, or 90% of it, or 25% of it, I think you have to figure that out. What do you want to do with that? But clearly, I think the issue that we're hearing from the community has been the brand new construction. I think that's been the primary concern. I haven't really heard a lot of that renovation was terrible. Now, some people might think it was terrible, but that hasn't turned into the kind of monsters. But yeah, I think you get into that detail of renovation versus new when you flesh it out.
I think we have a few more questions. Here's one on the general process. Can and will changes still be made? Can and will changes still be able to be made to the plan before it goes to the city?
Yeah, absolutely. So between now and April 1st, we're going to receive feedback on the draft plan that's out there. And then after that, we will bring this to the board, and the board will decide to vote on if they want to support this or not. And then it still goes through a whole process at the city, where the council member has to decide, are they going to vote for this, or do they want to vote? Because ultimately, the neighborhood does not vote to approve a plan of the city of Atlanta. Only the city council can approve a plan for the city of Atlanta. And the planning department needs to endorse it too. And so that's why it's everybody needing to work together, the city staff and the neighborhood and the council member. So yeah, the neighborhood will weigh in. I always like for the neighborhood to lend their support, but the NPU to weigh in and support what you're doing, but the NPU does not approve your master plan. The neighborhood, however the neighborhood typically works, for zoning decisions, for land use decisions, that's the same infrastructure you use to approve a neighborhood master plan. And last thing I want to say is, I think it's important, there's always, when you do a plan, right, there's some things that everyone agrees with. So when the plan says we love our children, then everyone's going to agree with that, and that's great. But then there's other things that are not so clear cut. There's other things that there's always going to be the folks who end up in the minority. And so I feel like as a planner that we need to document all the sides and show where there's consensus, but also be true to where there was dissenting opinion. And I don't want to create a plan that just shows the opinion of everybody who agreed with everything that's in the plan. So what the plan does and will continue to do as it gets finalized is reflect what we're hearing, even the things that we're hearing that still are not in the majority and don't reflect the consensus. That'll still get reflected.
And where's that in the plan?
So in the plan, what you'll see is every concept we've put out publicly through a public meeting and through a website, it's in the plan. And everything we've heard through the website or at a public meeting is reflected, the comments. Now, what we didn't do was list every single person's comment, but if 10 people said, I don't like this, we put it together and said 10 people said that. And that's all reflected in there. So I just want you all to know that as part of the process, that is what we'll continue to do. I think that's the fair thing to do, and so that even the people who are in the dissenting opinion can at least feel that, yeah, I did see what I said is in there. And that's what the plan will continue to have as it goes through the process.
Aaron, I'm sure you're getting tired, so
Got another hour.
we'll do a few more questions. How feasible is it to get a bridge over or tunnel under Monroe for the Beltline?
Yeah.
And what has the city planning department said about that?
Well, I don't know if we've missed that, but I don't, that's the first I've heard that, so maybe we missed that somewhere. There's a few challenges to that, and not that it's a bad idea, but there's some challenges to that. One is just an obvious one, which is money, and in planning process, you don't like to always say, don't go there because that's going to cost money. Everything costs money. But we do like to try and find, if there's another way to get the same thing done and it's 10% the cost, then maybe that's the better way to get it done. Because honestly, if it costs a lot, it probably isn't going to happen. The bridge would be very expensive. There's two more things. One is oftentimes the bridge kind of thing is, again, the sort of thing that from a character perspective doesn't completely fit in with this goal of trying to create a single-family neighborhood or retain a single-family neighborhood along the street. It feels a little bit more like, it's not something you would see right in a single-family neighborhood. But the other thing is that there's a perspective that the pedestrian and cycling advocates often have, which is the minute you develop infrastructure that kind of take people over a street or below a street, what it communicates to the driver is that they're not supposed to be out here, they're supposed to be up there. So that when somebody does try to cross the street, either there or the next light down, that when somebody's crossing the street at a crosswalk, that the driver's thinking they're not supposed to be there, and it becomes that aggressive sort of conflict with drivers and pedestrians. So those are just off the top of my head some of the things. I think the biggest one though is probably cost. There's been several bridge concepts in Atlanta that have just been killed because of the cost of building them. So I think it's possible to calm the street, and to slow the street down, and to create clearly delineated pedestrian crossing opportunities. And it's just so much easier to implement that. And you really can know from a budget standpoint with the city, you really can get that done.
So these are a series of questions about parking at the commercial node.
Right.
So I'm going to read these and you can address these various issues. Are there other ideas for providing more parking in the businesses? Are there ways to fund the decks that have already been approved? How many spots are there at Druid Hills Press? And can we use the parking at YWCA
Yeah, it's
for
good.
the commercial
Can
business?
you just give me one at a time?
Yeah, so the first one is, are there other ideas for providing more parking in the businesses and ways to fund the decks that have already been approved?
Right. So I want to be clear on this. When the neighbor commercial zoning was done, I guess now 4 years ago, no, it might be more than, yeah. So when the neighbor commercial zoning was done, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page with me, all of St. Charles commercial node, Virginia-Highland commercial node, Amsterdam commercial node used to be old zoning called C1, and it let you build like what you have at the CVS. So the zoning was changed to something called neighborhood commercial. It doesn't let you build the big parking lot in front, and makes it look a little bit more urban. So as part of that process, we also wanted to figure out, is it possible in certain locations to be able to fit a parking deck for development, but also maybe to even service the whole node. And what we found was that there were 3 particular sites, one in each node. One is obvious, Amsterdam, the back of the Amsterdam lot, there's some depth there that you could do that. The second one was behind Virginia-Highland, the northwest corner, Highland Tap, behind there. And then down to St. Charles, behind Roadhouse. But we sort of played with those and tried to see from a dimensional standpoint, could you fit a parking facility back here? And we found that it seemed like it was possible. But what I want to be clear on is that the NC zoning allows a parking deck to be built for any property. Now the reality is a lot of these parcels are so small that no one can build a parking deck on the parcel. So that just feasibly isn't going to happen. But I want to be clear that the NC zoning allows a parking structure to be built anywhere, but it has to look a certain way. In the NC zoning, a parking structure would have to have uses on the bottom, so you couldn't build a deck that just came right up to the street. The deck would have to look like a building. It'd have to look like it was like a normal building and be screened and designed to look that way. But I want to be clear, because I think that's kind of been a perception that there have been 3 places that the parking deck was approved for, and then kind of by default that maybe not everywhere else, but that's not the case. We just studied 3 sites to see, because we thought these were the 3 most likely sites, and they are, but the reality is that you can build a parking deck anywhere. So then the next question is, how does that happen? How does that get implemented? Well, parking decks are very expensive to build, and they're tricky things because you want customers to come and use it, and when you have to pay in the parking deck, then it's a little bit of a disincentive for a customer to use the parking deck. But parking decks are not free, and they don't build themselves, and they're very expensive. So there's a property owner has to undergo this whole analysis of, can I fit it? And can I meet all the design criteria that the zoning now has for it? Can I get ingress and egress to it? And can I afford it? What am I going to charge for people to park there? And is that going to fund the development? So there's a couple ways this could happen. One is that you just get a redevelopment somewhere. So the mix would be an example. That was something that was being proposed that who knows what's going to happen with that, but that was going to have a little parking deck. And so redevelopment could bring about a parking deck at some point. The other thing is that our city could get progressive and create a parking authority. And some cities use parking authorities as ways to provide parking in communities where there's a need, like a place like this, you could argue. But it's a municipal deck, it's a public deck, and the commercial property owners didn't have to do it on their own. There's no plans for that. There's been, for 20 years, the folks have been advocating the city to create a parking authority. There's no plans or action on their part to do that, but at some point they could do that. So I don't think anyone's lining up to build a parking deck right now, but it could happen.
Also, a park for hire parking lot requires a special use permit in the city. You can't just go build it.
And then Aaron, the last last questions on this parking issue are, how many spots at Druid Hills? I think you said.
Yeah, it's about 120. We're still trying to land on, if you're familiar with the back of their property there, it's hard to know where theirs end and where others begin. So it's about 120. And I will say, again, just to be transparent with the feedback, we've gotten some real feedback from folks who live right near there who say that, I don't know about that, or maybe they used to have been that before and didn't like how it worked. So we really think the management of the space, the maintenance, the supervision, the lighting, like, that's really got to get addressed. Those are legitimate concerns. It's the back of properties. It's hard to see back there. If it's dark and not managed and maintained, it can not be good. But I love, the back of the Highland, Virginia-Highland, the Highland Tap block. I just feel like it's got a lot of the same sort of features. It's not super visible, and that's managed, it's maintained, it's supervised, and it just feels like it's a safe option. So that would have to get done there.
Here is a question about Barnett. Barnett Street does not strike me as a suitable bicycle corridor due to the steep hill between Lanier and St. Charles. North Highland should receive a bike lane southbound between the St. Charles and Virginia nodes and Sharrows elsewhere.
Yeah. I think the city is considering, the city feels like that they could strike bike lanes on North Highland between the commercial nodes. And they're studying that right now. They're looking at that. The city, though, does not like, they're not going to be in favor of anything that gets rid of on-street parking. So if they could retain on-street parking and strike a bike lane between the commercial nodes, they'll want to do that. But they're still looking into that right now. So that could happen. And then you would retain the Sharrows in the commercial nodes because you can't do on-street parking and bike lanes in the commercial nodes. But I kind of think, I love this, the parklet idea. I just think it's cool and interesting and new. And personally, I feel like one of the things we heard through the process from some of the commercial property owners was that they've observed that Virginia-Highland has lost a little bit of that, that this was the place to go. And in some ways that maybe, you might think, oh, that's good, I'm glad we kind of got rid of that. But as a business owner, that is an interesting situation to be in. So I think that the parklets and expanding the sidewalk infrastructure, but doing it in a way that are these platforms that are much cheaper than going and pouring new sidewalk. It's interesting, and it gets people talking about Virginia-Highland. And it gets people talking about, did you hear what's going on in Virginia-Highland? Have you seen what's going on in Virginia-Highland? Because local businesses oftentimes will partner wherever there's a parklet, and they kind of breathe life into the adjacent parklet. And maybe it's outdoor dining, and maybe it's some representation of what their business is, and it gets very creative. And I think it could be a really great way to expand your sidewalk infrastructure in a much cheaper way, and to continue to make Virginia-Highland a place that's interesting for all the right reasons. You don't want to become interesting because you're replicating Buckhead Village from 15 years ago. That's not really the win. But there's ways to become interesting and attractive in ways that's just win-win. And I think the parklets could do that.
So Aaron, I think a final question, and again, we'll do an FAQ for the questions that we didn't get to. And this is about the process. Do you really feel that focus groups of 30 people and informally gathered feedback are sufficient to represent the true views of our entire neighborhood of approximately 6,000 households, as opposed to formally capturing yes, no opinion for all proposed requests? And on top of that, how does the process that you've used here compare to the process you've used for other master plans?
Yeah, so I always get this question, and so it's a great question to think through, is what is an acceptable process to be able to determine the future of a neighborhood? And the reality down at City Hall is that it doesn't take much. Right? I mean, to decide your future, there's decisions happening every day at City Hall that are guiding the future of your neighborhood. And so there's not a huge